your values are changing, how do you know who the real you is? Hi there, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Syra, the show where I answer your questions about mental health, personal growth, and relationships. Today's question comes from Asim. Asim asks, how do values change over time? If my values are changing, how do I know who the real me is? How do values change over time? If my values are changing, how do I know who the real me is? It's a really interesting question, Asim. And I had to really think about this one to say, like what? And I thought about people who I work with in counseling. Because often when people come to counseling, there's some things that they want to change about themselves. And through a process of discovery, they make some changes about the things that are important to them. So how do you know what's the real you? Well, I would say that first of all, let's think about where we get our values, right? So we inherit our values when we're born based on the families that we're born into. We just kind of like, there's a set of values, you just get put in that context, and then you kind of imbibe those values as you grow. Now, some of those values might not be the best or the most supportive to you. And so what I find in adulthood is many of us spend some portion of our adulthood actually unlearning the importance of some of the things that we used to value before. So an example might be, looking good in front of people who are watching. That might be a value that was, I know in our family, that was a value that was important, like making sure that, you look right and people don't judge you and you're showing up in the world in a certain way. I had to spend some of my adult life actually unlearning that and learning about how authenticity became a primary value rather than how it looks being the value, right? So I had to kind of like make that adjustment to say, actually, how it looks to the world I don't want that to be my value anymore. What will people say? I don't want that to be my value. What is more important to me is really showing up as a true being, which means that some of my crusty parts are going to show sometimes, which means I'm not going to be good at everything I try, right? Because I'm only going to show the things that process had to be an unlearning process. So some of the values that we have are things that, like I said, we inherited, and we actually make a choice to unlearn and let go of those values. Now, does that mean you're not the real you? I wouldn't say so. I would say it's finding, kind of going through the layers of other people's expectations and values and what you've inherited to the core of what really matters to you, right? Which is a process of unlearning, actually. The second thing I would think about in that question is the difference between evolution and jumping, I call it jumping selves, right? So if you think about yourself a few years ago or sometime in the past, likely for many of us, we're one kind of particular person in one context, and we're a little bit of a different person in another context, and we're a little bit of a different person in a third context. And that's kind of how society encourages us to be, right? Like you're not really going to be the same person that you are at like a slumber party with your girlfriends as you are at a business meeting, right? There's a little bit of a different way that we show up, a little different flavor. Now, are those different selves? I don't think so. Right? I think that's the same self, just different parts of us are kind of put in the front, right? And that's a process of evolution, being able to bring out certain qualities of us in the forefront, depending on what the circumstances is requiring. That's a skill, and that's a sign of emotional maturation when you're able to pull pieces of yourself to the forefront, as opposed to jumping into these different selves that you've created for the show. Right? That, oh, in this context, I have to act this way. And in this context, so you're like kind of jumping away, jumping around rather than pulling parts of yourself out. So it's a little bit of a different way of talking about values. But what I'm saying is that when we're being our real selves, when we're evolving, we're not actually judging or hiding any aspect of ourselves. Everything is available, just one thing is more in the front, versus cutting parts of us off to fit into these different roles as we jump around and we have these jumping into different selves. I don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully you followed that kind of distinction between the evolution, pulling things forward, versus distinct roles and identities that you're trying to jump. Because if you do that, at some point it's all going to come crashing down, because those worlds may, like the world of work and the world of home may connect at some point. Now, are you your work self, or your home self, or your work? And so we don't want to set ourselves up for that by jumping selves. The final thing I would say about that question is, when we know better, we do better, right? So there may be things that were really important to you for a long time, and then as you grew and as you changed, you realize, like, actually this other thing is way more valuable to me than what I thought, and I actually don't want to put importance to this particular thing. So rather than saying who's the real me, it's like, well, back then I actually didn't know better, right? I thought that it actually helped me to think about what other people thought, because that's what made me a hard worker. That's what made me ambitious. That's what made me strive for excellence, right? And so it actually moved me, and it was helpful for me to think that way. And now, that same impulse of what will people think is actually a barrier, and it stops me from evolution. It stops me from growing. And so back then that was important. Now that I know better, now that I have a different perspective and lens on my life, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. So it's not that you're losing the real you. It's that the way I think of it is that the real you is always there. It's always been there since the day that you were born, or maybe conceived, or maybe before that. The real you's always been there. Life has put on all of these layers on top of you through your years, especially through your childhood. And as we become adults, we start pulling those layers away, getting closer and closer back to the real us that was always there. You can't lose that. It's with you. It's always been with you, right? That's the real you. And one of the things I ask my clients to do to figure out, like, who's the real me, is actually just take a moment and be still, right? Letting thoughts just kind of float by as they go, but making an attempt to go inward and be still and actually get curious about, like, what's really going on inside of me. If I turn off the noise of this world, I turn off the noise of my own judgment and my own mind, what's actually going on here? And that real you, generally what I found is that really has one value, and that is love, right? That's what we're all kind of designed for, is to share our love, to receive love, and to share love. And I know that sounds a little hokey to some people, but it's been my experience, right? To learn, to grow, to love. These are the things that we were designed for. And so you can't lose that. You can cover it up with all kinds of life experiences and beliefs, and then you can uncover it if you want to. So that's what I would say about changing values. Hopefully that was clear. The 3 different areas, remembering that we're spending a lot of our adult life unlearning and letting go. And so that's a natural process when it comes to our values. Second is the difference between evolution versus jumping selves. And so making sure that you're letting yourself evolve and not falling into that mistake of jumping selves. And finally, giving yourself a break. When you know better, you do better, right? Things don't matter to you anymore, that's probably okay. You're at a different stage and phase, and you've seen things in the world that you just didn't know about before. So those are my thoughts. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.